I want to talk to you about a very important issue today, but one that will seem to be sufficiently complicated that you may not have paid much attention to what little media attention it has received. And more than that, it might strike a lot of people as not being a church topic. That is, it may seem to be far too deep into the weeds of politics to be an appropriate sermon subject. I want to talk about our nation's moves towards voter suppression. Now, in most black churches, this will not be an obscure topic, but in the majority white congregations, today's message might be the first time that voters' rights or voter suppression efforts may have ever even been mentioned. But before I launch into that topic, I feel a need to lay a foundation for why I, a minister, would bring this topic to the pulpit. To do that, I'm going to have to take you to seminary with me for a few minutes and do something that you rarely hear me doing, which is to look at the minutiae of New Testament gospel language and the use of a particular word, a word that is used all the time in churches, but which is almost entirely misunderstood. And that word is salvation. If I were to ask you, based on your experience in churches and Sunday school, or even in some college and I fear seminary classes, what does salvation mean? What might you say? Based on how we hear it used in religious circles, we could predict that for most people, being saved means that they have been redeemed, they have been, as some might even say, washed in the blood of Christ. They've been forgiven of their sins and set on a path towards eternity in heaven. When you hear most evangelicals talking about how many people were saved at a certain revival, or when they tell their own story about when and how that they were saved, or they are telling people how that they can be saved, they're meaning that a person's destiny has suddenly entirely shifted from an eternity in a burning hell into a path towards eternity in heaven when they die. That's what it usually means, right? The word that is translated to save or to be saved in the original Koine Greek of the New Testament is soteria or sesoken. It appears very often in the New Testament, but it's not always translated into English in the same way. Translation is an art more than it is an exact science. Every language has its curious idioms, and it's up to the translator to try to write what the sentence means more than just a word-for-word translation. Translators have to make a lot of decisions. And unfortunately, those decisions are oftentimes based on their own religious prejudices, their own theological assumptions of what the author probably meant, or maybe even what the author should have meant. About 25 years ago, I was attending a World Congress of Preachers in Edinburgh, Scotland, where the famous homiletics professor, Dr. Will Willimon from Duke, was a keynote speaker. And he kept talking about people being saved, and he repeated the word so often that I finally just interrupted him, and I held up my hand and said, Dr. Willimon, you do realize that there is no past tense of the word salvation in the Bible. No one in the Bible ever got saved. It's a process verb. The Bible speaks of people being saved, a journey, a direction, a way of living, but it's never in the past tense. You know, if you don't believe me, you can look it up in the Bible in Acts chapter 2, where the author describes the triumphant birth of the church as thousands of people were said to have been baptized on that day. The author says in verse 48, and day by day the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. They didn't get saved, but Acts says that they started the journey. They were being saved. It was a very awkward moment in that Congress because most of the people there were evangelicals. And Willimon was enough of a scholar to know that I was right, but he also knew his audience. And so he looked at me and he said, let me point out to everyone that it was Roger Ray who said that and not me. And from that point on, no one at the conference spoke to me again, nor was I ever invited to attend again, not that I would have. The evangelical church thinks that salvation, in terms of not going to hell and getting to go to heaven, is frankly the only product that they've got to sell. And if they had taken seriously my point about no one in the Bible ever got saved, then their entire religious world would crumble. But you don't even have to wade into the nuances of the translation to get this point. Chapter 14 of Matthew, for example, the author describes a miraculous event in which he says that Jesus was walking on the water and never wanted to be left out. Peter wants to do it too. And so he starts out and he immediately starts to drown. And what does Peter say? Lord, save me. Sesoken. Now, does anyone believe that Peter was asking Jesus in that moment to make his soul go to heaven when he died? Or did he rather want a hand out of the water so he wouldn't drown, which is what, in fact, Jesus did? So if being saved is not about a purely afterlife spiritual transformation, you might have reason to ask, and you should. What does it actually mean? So glad you asked. On this slide, I have 5 instances in which the word sesoken is used in the Gospels of Mark and Luke. Both Gospels give an account of a woman who had a continuous menstrual flow who touched the hem of Jesus' cloak and was healed. One was an account of a healing of a man who had been blind from birth. Another was the forgiveness of the sins of a woman of ill repute. And the last one was about a man who was healed of leprosy. In each instance, the people are said to have received salvation. That's the word in Greek. But only in one case was there any mention of sins being forgiven. And in each case, the translators, depending upon which one you're reading, tend to give themselves permission to translate this one word, sesoken, differently. When the event describes a medical problem being solved, they say that they were healed. They only say saved when it's someone who was forgiven of sexual sins, that the immoral woman was forgiven her sins and thus saved by faith. But to the gospel writers, a woman who had a menstrual flow, her being healed, the man whose sight was restored, the leper who was cured, they were all saved. Let me be very specific. The Gospels talk about being made whole, about being restored to wholeness, and that is what the word means. Salvation means to be made whole. Women were to separate themselves from society in Jewish societies when they had their period. But if a woman had a constant vaginal hemorrhage, she was never allowed to be around family, friends, neighbors. A man who was blind from birth was separated from society by virtue of a serious physical handicap. People with leprosy were not even allowed to segregate themselves within their community. They had to go outside the village. They literally had to live in the wild and never be around other people. And of course, a woman with a reputation of immorality would be shunned by family and peers and synagogue. Far from what you may have been told about salvation, at least in a more literate biblical sense, it's not at all about going to heaven when you die. It's about bringing marginalized people back into the society, making them whole again, making them whole human beings. If I may make a bit of an aside here, this is what Christianity was before Paul messed it up by turning it into a religion. I may say more about that at another time, and in fact, it probably won't take very much to make me do it. That is why the Jesus of the Gospels had a bad reputation for hanging out with sinners and tax collectors. He was always trying to grab people at the margins and bring them back in. And so he was a friend to prostitutes and the unclean. the people that society wanted to dispose of, to marginalize, to push out of the village. Those are the very people that Jesus sought to bring salvation to by bringing them back into the culture. Now, please don't be mad at me if this is the first time that you've ever heard salvation talked about in this way. I learned this at Vanderbilt 45 years ago. So any pastor educated in the past 2 generations at any decent school already knows this. And if they have led you to believe something different, that is not my fault. That is their fault for lacking the courage to speak up against the prevailing superstitious thinking that salvation is getting a ticket for the soul train to heaven. The very suggestion of which is so preposterous, you ought to be a little embarrassed that you ever believed it. Now, we can blame the self-appointed Apostle Paul for turning Jesus into a get-out-of-hell-free magical figure. But if you look at the Gospels through the critical lens of history, what Jesus actually did, what was his purpose? It was to teach, to be an example of compassion. Marcus Borg worded it perfectly, saying that Jesus was the teacher of radical compassion. That was his job description. The miracles of the New Testament may have been rather elaborately stated in order to convince people of how great that Jesus was. But if you look behind the miracles, if you don't look at them as a publicity stunt, in each case, Jesus was restoring people to the kind of wholeness that reconnected them to their society, their culture, their people. And at that level, these events do not show us how amazing that Jesus was. They are not to portray Jesus as some kind of Marvel comic book superhero. They were, and please don't miss this point, they were to show you what you can do. Can you hear that? Jesus was not to be worshiped. He was to be followed. He wasn't a substitutionary sacrifice, not some God on a stick to be covered in gold in cathedrals. He was a teacher, an example, showing us what we can do. So if his job description was teacher of radical compassion, inasmuch as anybody wants to identify with him, then their job description is teacher of radical compassion. This could also be said, I'm pretty sure, about the historical Buddha. We may have to provoke our own Dharma teacher, David, to speak to that event. But now, as I told you a few minutes ago, I want to talk to you about voter suppression. And I wanted to take you to seminary for a minute on the way to that topic to make it clear that pushing Black, brown, and poor people to the margins, making it harder for minorities to participate in society, to be fully human, to have the same rights as everyone else, this is not a political issue. It's not just conservative Republicans trying to stay in power. That is the powerful trying to take away the humanity of the vulnerable, trying to turn poverty into the equivalent of first century leprosy. The reason that David and I so often talk about racism and poverty and sexual discrimination is because so much of the cultural influence of the powerful is used to make the vulnerable broken. Preaching, then, if it's actual prophetic preaching, is always about trying to restore wholeness to those who have been broken by the world. It's about salvation. You rarely catch us describing it that way because it would just confuse the people that are still locked into a kind of twisted church speak, but that's what it is. Let me just illustrate what I'm saying. Everyone listening who owns a car, lives in a middle-class neighborhood, how long did you stand in line to vote the last time you voted? 5 minutes? A minute? In the 2020 election in Georgia, in some predominantly minority voting places, people waited as long as 10 hours. 6 hours was not uncommon. This happened because ever since the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2012, the former slave-holding states of the South have been reducing the number of polling places in minority districts, even as the total number of voters has gone up by millions. This is obviously an undeniable effort to undo the civil rights movement. They cannot take away the right to vote from minorities, but they can make it so difficult to vote that they probably won't go to the polls. This indefensible and horrible move on the part of Georgia didn't keep enough black voters away from the polls, so after the election of 2016, Georgia made it illegal to pass out water or food to people standing in line to vote, or the 2020 election, rather. This, I submit, is not politics. This is racism. You see that, don't you? I went to some links earlier to explain to you why David and I preach about racism and poverty. I hope that you can see that talking about voters' rights is a spiritual issue more than it is a political issue, because the root cause of voter suppression is evil. It is racist. And if other preachers are not talking about voters' rights, then I think they've got some splaining to do, right? I may not be a smart man, but I know what racism is. After we had record voter turnout in 2020, 19 states moved immediately to suppress votes, to pass legislation to suppress votes. The worst of them were Florida, Georgia, Texas, Montana, Iowa, Arkansas, and Kansas. It is now almost as if Johnson's landmark Voters' Rights Act had never been passed, and racism is making a solid return to these United States. And yet where, pray tell, is the voice of the religious community? Silence is assent, right? If you let it go on passively without comment, then it looks like you're okay with it. There were 25 million votes cast in the 2020 presidential election. And now, after more than a year of investigations into potential fraudulent voting, we have been able to find 475 cases of possibly fraudulent voter identification. Most of those 475 were people voting for deceased relatives. They were voting Republican and they were voting for Donald Trump. So if the 2020 election was fixed, they tried to fix it for Donald Trump. Still, 475 cases of fraud out of 25 million votes? That's 1 out of every 53,000 votes. That is statistically an insignificant number. And yet many states are enacting laws, and Missouri is one of them, requiring that every voter now show a government-issued photo ID in order to vote. And a good friend of mine challenged me when I was ranting about this. Why would you object to that? Everyone's got a driver's license or a passport. Really? Everyone? Who might not have a driver's license or a passport? Could it be people who are too poor to ever travel outside of the United States, or possibly even too poor to own a car? Or let's say 11% of the people who are eligible to vote in America do not currently have a government-issued photo ID. That is 21 million people. You're going to make it impossible for 20 million people to vote because 475 people might have voted illegally. This is what white privilege looks like. I've had a driver's license for so long, I can easily assume that everyone has a driver's license. Well, shoot, doesn't everybody have a car? These states know that voter fraud is rare and that not having a photo ID is common among minorities. Let's not be stupid. This is not about voter fraud. This is about voter suppression, specifically suppressing the votes of the poor, most of whom are minorities. Trump cast doubts on mail-in votes because people who don't own cars and the elderly often prefer to use mail-in voting. Southern states have shortened the early voting period to cut out Sunday voting to stop black churches from busing voters from church to the polls in their popular Souls to the Polls programs that used to take place across the South. In every state, the state's Secretary of State oversees elections. And since the 2020 election, 4 states have elected secretaries of state who insist that the 2020 election was fraudulent, and if they had been Secretary of State, they would have negated the vote. So now Nevada, Alabama, New Mexico, and Indiana have all elected Republican secretaries of state who say that they would not have validated the 2020 election in their states. Folks, we've been too passive these past few years. We elected a dangerous sociopath to the presidency in 2016. And even though he's been out of office for a year and a half, the news media still talks about him every single day, because his fascist influence is still alive and well in this country. We have endured the unethical and illegal appointment of unqualified right-wing lunatics to the Supreme Court, changing the nature of our judiciary for at least a generation. And now, especially in Texas, even minimum wage part-time election judges are made to literally fear for their lives just for safeguarding the election process. Now, I'm an election judge in my voting precinct, and I can tell you that I don't want to be. I hate doing it. You have to go for boring training sessions and then put in a 16-hour-long day on election days, which are just tedious. But I can tell you, I recently sat through a 16-hour day as an election judge, and there were at least a dozen times that I had to remind the other judges sitting at the table with me what the laws in our state are about what kind of IDs they can demand and whether or not they can actually help a disabled or challenged voter to mark their ballots. There are people all around us who no longer believe in democracy, and they are willing to tilt towards the kind of fascism that will take the humanity away from the poor and the minorities. And the only thing that will stop it is if persons of good conscience and courage will step up and get involved. So people, please, never fail to vote. Be involved in voter registration drives. Give people a ride to the polls. Be an election judge if you can, and if you possibly can, run for office yourself. Don't turn our democracy over to fascism. As Elie Wiesel said, we must always take sides, because neutrality serves the oppressor, but never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Let's be on the right side of history.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.